The Mulberry Tree. Thomas had not been able to speak with Mr. Jenkins for 2 days after his mother had given him permission. On the first day, Mr. Jenkins was too occupied in business, and on the second he was home ill. But on the third, Thomas presented himself to the merchant and made his request. Mr. Jenkins rubbed the back of his neck. He was a grim but kindly man who had left Edinburgh 10 years before. He had been a faithful Covenanter in his days there, but everything was different on the Chesapeake, and so he was willing to offer his own form of dissenting worship at St. Anne's. Still, he was completely unrepentant about his past and had once told Thomas some stories about the killing times that had filled Thomas with a mixture of horror and delight. Once, when the rector at St. Anne's had mentioned those days in a sermon, with his Anglican view of them, Mr. Jenkins had walked past Thomas after service, muttering and shaking his head angrily. "Ye kin call a sheep's tail a leg, but that don't help him to walk. Murder is murder for that." But now Thomas was standing at his warehouse, holding his hat nervously in front of him. "So ye want to go to sea, lad. 'Tis a good thing. I was starting to wonder about ye. I can give ye a letter. Your mother is a good woman, and I can tell ye who to take it to. The prudent Hannah is due to return from Jamaica in about a month. Her captain is John Monroe." Thomas was thrilled. "I might be able to go to sea in a month? Not's quick, laddie. The prudent Hannah is due to be careened, and Captain Monroe told me she needs many repairs beyond that. But once that is done, he wants to get in one more Caribbean voyage before winter." Thomas was grinning widely, and so Mr. Jenkins glowered in his kindly way. "But I can only recommend ye. I can't add ye to his crew. He is a good man, but he is a stickler for work. He will probably have you work for him in port before he takes you in his crew." "I can work," Thomas said eagerly. "Now dut," the Scotsman said. With the prospect of going to sea looming before him, Thomas finished the navigation book with a will, and then tried to fill his days doing odd jobs at Reynolds Inn. But there was not much for him to do, and so he took to filling his afternoons by taking long walks. He knew he would miss that when he finally got to go to sea. One afternoon, he was a number of miles south of town, and he stood alone at the end of a small inlet off the Severn River. He glanced at the sun and estimated that he needed to start walking home soon. The inlet gradually worked its way toward the solid ground by means of a marshy strip covered with cattails. Thomas quietly stood and thought, throwing bits of stick into the water. The day was quiet, and although it was summer, it was not too humid. The green trees around the inlet hovered over the face of the water and reflected a deep green all around the edge of the water. Suddenly a bowsprit appeared to the left, out in the river, belonging to a small sloop coming upriver. He didn't know why, but Thomas quickly stepped back into the trees. There was a sharp hill behind him, and Thomas scrambled quickly up the hill. He remembered a good view of the inlet from the top when he was walking down. This was an isolated area. No inhabitants for miles north or south, and any ship like this was as likely to be a pirate ship as not. "I need to make myself scarce," Thomas thought. Thomas stood quietly at the top of the hill and watched as the small sloop hove into the inlet and dropped anchor. After about 15 minutes, a shore boat was lowered from the side, and 3 men got in it. 2 of them began rowing straight in Thomas's direction, while the other sat in the stern looking intently at a package in his hands. The boat disappeared from his view, and Tom looked around. Near the top of the hill was a gigantic wild mulberry tree. Thomas could have escaped detection easily by heading inland, but by now he was very curious. He decided to stay in order to find out what they were doing and to climb the mulberry tree to avoid being discovered. It was a good climbing tree, and Thomas was able to get high up in its branches. He lodged himself in a crook near the top, knowing that he was completely invisible unless they climbed up the tree too. He hoped to be able to hear what the men were doing and possibly to catch a glimpse of them. "Here's a big tree, lads. Can you remember this?" Thomas realized with a shock that the voices were coming from the base of his tree. There was no answer, probably because the 2 oarsmen just nodded. Then one of them, a different voice, spoke. "I don't like it, O'Connor. If Captain James finds out we're crossing him, he'll stick his gold toothpick in each of our eyes, and that would just be to start with." "We're not crossing him," O'Connor's voice was soothing. "Leastways, not that anybody knows. This package probably ain't worth nothing. I'm just curious about it, that's all." The other voice joined in. "I don't know either." "Look," O'Connor said a little loudly, "James made us the prize crew, didn't he? He told us we could have whatever was on board, didn't he?" "That's because he thought there wasn't nothing on board." "Well, you 2 are too far in now anyhow. You were hot for the plan a whiles ago, and James will do whatever he wants just because you came this far. Let's just bury this and we can come back later for it. Can you remember this tree?" 2 reluctant voices replied. "Now dig the hole. We have to head south, so we gin up with the others there in a reasonable way. We don't want the lads thinking we sailed up to Philadelphia. If they start asking questions, you two sisters would probably tell them everything you know, which ain't much, but it would be troubling now." Thomas sat quietly in his crook and listened carefully to everything. After the space of 20 minutes or so, the brief comments, grunts, and scrapings from down below stopped. "Good work, Aunt. Let's go, lads." Thomas, looking out, could see the inlet, and there was the sloop rocking back and forth on its anchor. He could see 2 or 3 other hands moving around on deck. Thomas waited a long time before he could see the boat again. The man named O'Connor was at his place in the stern once more, this time with his back to Thomas, and his 2 confederates were steadily rowing. Thomas continued to watch them, expecting nothing but to see them depart as they had come. But what he saw next filled him with horror, and almost caused him to fall out of the tree. When they were a boat length from the sloop, with one motion, O'Connor pulled 2 pistols from his belt and calmly shot both men at the same moment. In one instant, Thomas saw 2 puffs of smoke. One of the men stand and toppled over the side, and the other one slumped over his oar. He saw O'Connor stand and bend over the seamen still in the boat, and then he heard the dull crack of the pistol reports. He was sick at his stomach, and his hands were instantly clammy. He watched with a horrified interest as O'Connor hoisted the second oarsman up and pushed him into the water. He continued to stare, and O'Connor reached the ship, secured the boat, and hoisted anchor. The other sailors were apparently in on it, for they gave O'Connor a hand up as though nothing had happened. Thomas wondered vaguely how O'Connor was going to explain the loss of his 2 men to Captain John James. James was a notorious pirate on the Chesapeake, one who had filled the authorities with consternation more than once. Thomas watched silently as the sloop disappeared out of the inlet. When he could climb down from the tree, he had little difficulty in finding the place where the hole had been dug. He had no shovel to dig with, but he brushed away the leaves with his hands and started to lift the loose dirt out with his hands as well. The hole was only about 2 feet deep, and at the bottom was a small oilskin package. The shallow burial either meant the contents of the hole were not important, or that O'Connor was only intending to hide the package there for a very short time, but one of these options was not a reasonable one. Thomas knew that the oilskin package at the bottom of the hole was something worth murdering 2 comrades for, and that meant that O'Connor would be back soon enough. On his knees, with trembling hands, he opened the package and stared at the contents, mystified. There were 2 pieces of paper, one of them a folded chart. It had no peculiar markings of any kind on it, and was the kind of hand-drawn chart Thomas had seen countless times before. The other was a simple piece of paper, covered with strange ciphers. He stared at both for a few moments, but realized that this would take a great deal of study. He stood and started to walk away from the hole, leaving it open and empty. Then he stopped, shaking his head at his own stupidity. That would tell O'Connor that someone had seen them. If he filled the hole back in again, then O'Connor might think that one of the seamen he killed had sneaked the package out before they buried it. He went back and pushed the dirt back into the hole and covered it over with leaves again. As he walked home, his mind was filled with excitement. If these were pirates, and they were, and this was a map, and it was, then there was likely a treasure to be had. But O'Connor didn't seem to be sure that this was a treasure. Of course, that may just have been for show so that his 2 companions did not revolt. If they knew that a vast treasure was at stake, then they would no doubt panic at the prospect of crossing someone like John James. So there probably was a treasure, and then Thomas stopped walking for a moment in his excitement. He could take care of his mother. The only questions were how great the treasure was and how to decipher the map. A moment later, he was not sure again. Maybe it was just paper. When he got back to town, he hid the strange package in the stables behind the inn, and got ready to go have dinner with his mother. He was consumed with curiosity, but he knew that he couldn't tell his mother the story until he knew more about what was in the package, and that looking carefully at the contents of the package must wait until the next day. He also knew that she was very likely to want him to take what he had found and turn it over to the governor's men, but that would make it public knowledge who had found it, and it would tell O'Connor who had witnessed his murders. Maybe he shouldn't say anything at all to anybody. Thomas knew that he had to think about it. He started to go in, and then remembered the dirt on his hands. That would require an explanation. He turned around and went back out to the stables, where he scooped water out of the trough for the horses and carefully washed his hands. He shook his hands carefully until they were dry, walked up the back entrance of the inn, and went inside. For all the excitement, he wasn't very late.